Hey everyone, hello. Thank you so much for joining another live session today on our YouTube channel and as well as on Trailhead Live. My name is Mohith. I am a developer advocate here at Salesforce, and these are my Twitter handles and email in case if you have any questions regarding this presentation. So today we're gonna live code some Node.js service and try to push it on Heroku to work with Salesforce Composite Graph API. Now, chats are open, so feel free to do some chats. And before we get started, obviously you've seen this a forward-looking statement. So please do not make any purchasing decisions based on anything forward-looking that I might make in this presentation. So before we get started, let's move through a couple of slides for some of you who might be very new to the terminology here. So what is Composite API? So Composite API is designed to minimize the round trip between client and the server. So for example, let's say you want to create accounts in system and contacts, and let's say you have another object, a junction object called account contact role. So to create this, with regular REST API, you might need 3 different requests. That is, first one, you create account. The second one, once you get the account ID, you create contact with the account ID that you obtained from the first result. And then once you got contact ID, then you create account contact role. So as you can see, there are 3 different calls, right? And that's why the Composite API is designed, because what it allows you to do is it allows you to group all of these and send as one request. So with that, less number of APIs is consumed. And also, you don't have to do multiple calls, and your code is pretty much cleaner. Now, this API has been there from quite a while now, and it also allows you to do some independent requests. You can batch the requests, but this API is limited to 25 sub requests. So the moment you go more than 25, you will have to issue another Composite API. So that's the limitation with this API. Now, what is Composite Graph API? So Composite Graph API essentially allows you to assemble more complicated and series of related records. For example, as you can see on my screen, let's say I have a very complex use case with a more than one relationship level down. Like, let's say in this example, I have account, contact, and opportunities, leads, campaign member. As you can see, there are almost at 5-6 objects involved already in this. So if your request sort of goes complex, then you basically use the power of the Composite Graph API, which was added very recently, maybe a couple of releases back. I don't recall on top of my head when this was added, but it looked really interesting for me to try it out. One consideration that you'll have to do when you're actually using Composite Graph API is it's all or none, meaning if any of the requests actually fails in this, so I'll talk about more the structure of Composite API, but note that in that Composite Graph API, you have a sub-composite graph. So in your graph, if one of the requests actually fails, it just fails everything and everything is rolled back. So that's one consideration that you have to consider. So let's quickly recap a bit before we actually deep dive and start implementing it. Composite API versus Composite Graph API, right? So Composite Graph API is designed for complicated related objects, right? So it is designed to assemble them, and also, it has far more higher limits than Composite API. One thing you have to consider, it's all or none. And also, Composite Graph API is limited to only few APIs, and I'll talk about that. That's one of the limitations that you'll have to consider when you are sort of designing. The other thing is the Composite API have certain limits, like the number of nodes that you can go, the depth of the nodes that you can go, and also the different types of APIs that you can support. So before we actually get and deep dive, let's actually see if there is any chat. So feel free to again use the chat, and we can keep the conversation going here. So if you actually look into, let's say, Salesforce Composite Graph API documentation. So one of the things I wanted you to walk through before we actually kind of start implementing is definitely its structure. So you essentially create an object, and then you have a key called graph. And this graph has, it can be an array and an object which has the graph ID, and then it can have multiple composite requests. So it's an array of composite request which has composite sub request in it. Okay. And the more importantly, I want to talk about some of the design considerations and the limitations before we actually deep dive. So one of the limitation I was talking about, right? So Composite Graph API does not support like all types of REST APIs. Like you can only sort of create sub composite requests for these APIs. That is, if you're working with S object and you want to post data, or let's say if you want to do a delete, get, or patch, or if you want to work with an external ID. So Composite Graph API sort of allows you to do only those little things there. The other thing that you want to pay attention to is the number of depths, like your depth of the graph that you're constructing. So note that you cannot have, or you cannot go beyond a depth of 15. So what is our depth? So depth is basically, it's the maximum number of edges in the graph, right? So, let's consider an example here, right? So if, if you have two sub requests and they are interrelated like this, you have the first one is depth 1, second one is depth 2. Now you have further relations, you will add another depth. So that depth will keep on incrementing as you establish more and more relations within that graph. Okay. Also, the other thing that I want to talk about is all or none here. And also there is this best practice of, to keep it efficient, you have to equally distribute your graphs. That means, you cannot have, like, let's say one graph with 500 nodes. You will certainly hit the limits. Actually, one or the other limits you will hit. So you equally space the graphs. That means, you can have 50 graphs. Probably each of the graph can have like 10 different nodes, rather than like having one graph with 500 nodes. So this is something to consider when you're sort of working through this. Okay, enough words. Actually, let's actually go and start implementing something so that we can see this in action. And it's pretty neat little API. Honestly, if you want to like create sample data, previously, we used to use this tree API or the Composite API to create references and data. Now with Composite Graph API, you can usually use this API and sort of create a Salesforce CLI plugin, or let's say you want to create a node script that can insert some random test data into Salesforce. You can do that with like one single request. So that's the power of this Composite Graph API. Okay, with that, actually, let's get on to our code. Let's see if there are any chats. Okay, no chats. Okay, so before we see, right, so one thing I wanted to actually show was the structure, right? So for the example that I was showing, let's look at that example here. So for this example, right, if I try to write a Composite Graph API JSON structure, it will look something similar to this. That is, you will have a composite, you'll have a graph ID, and then you start with like the parent, right? So a composite request has what we call it as sub request. So this is called composite sub request. So for example, I want to insert campaign into the system. So I'll provide the method in the body. The body will have the data, and then let's say an account. But let's say I have a relationship, right? The way I do that is all of these composite sub request has what we call it as reference IDs. So you can use that reference ID. So in this example, account 2 is related to account 1. So I can use the reference ID here as account 2. Okay. and it's badly storming here, so I'm hoping that my streams do not disconnect. We'll see what happens. So again, so the next one is like contact, right? So in this contact API, again, contact depends on account, so you can easily use that reference ID. So it is related to account 2, so I can use that in my body as a reference, so I do that with this at symbol and then placing a bracket like this. Okay. So similarly, we have opportunity, which is related to an account, and then we have leads, and then we have campaign member, which relates to campaign and the leads. So this is a comprehensive example. It has, all the objects, all the standard objects, right? So really useful if you're trying to create so many related data or related entities together and tie the data together. This API is so much useful. Now let's actually implement this. Now, an example implementation for this is in our eCars repo. So if you go to eCars, let's actually go to Trailhead Apps and see eCars repo. So eCars, we show some examples of how to actually work this inside a Node project. Let me bump it a bit. So if you actually go to one of our apps and go to our PWA and then look into, sorry, it's not PWA. I think it's probably the services, not services. Be real time, not real time. Maybe it's PWA. Okay. So yeah, so if you look at the server and if you look at this file, we show you how to actually implement it. So this is how you can actually use JSForce and implement it. So essentially you construct a graph like the one that I was showing and put all the related objects, and you can use the JSForce to do a post. So the problem with this, like I like this approach, and more I was thinking about, okay, how do we like sort of keep the code a bit cleaner than this, than just stubbing the objects like this. Was actually building a utility, and I was reviewing some of the code from my colleague Kevin Poorman the other day, where he was using this pattern, and it was called Fluent Interface pattern. Okay. So I took some time to look at that pattern, just read through the wiki, and was seeing this pattern. It actually makes your code like cleaner to read through. Be it in any language, even in Apex, you can use this Fluent interfaces and make your code really clean to read. It takes some effort actually to structure your code that way, but once you like got the structure working, you will see the advantage that the code is very clean. So last night I tweeted something about it. I was basically just trying to think through, okay, let's implement one of these, and I came up with something like this. That okay, I should design an API or basically the implementation for this in JavaScript using something like this, where I'll have a file which I'll require it. If you can see this, right? So I have a file where I'll require something, and then once I do that, right, I'll construct the sub request first, and be very explicit and fluent here with, okay, what is my method, what is my URL, what is my reference IDs, what is my body, and then build that. So, and then build the multiple sub requests, right? And then I can say, okay, I want to build a graph out of it. So I can say graph builder, I'll design a graph builder class. So I can say graph builder dot, graph ID, and then keep adding the composite request to this, and then build the graph. And finally, once I build the graph, I add that graph to the, to the composite graph builder interface, and then build it, right? So this is like cleaner to maintain. And again, it looked like, okay, there's going to be some effort initially building this up, but once I sort of get this structure in place, it would be a lot easier to maintain and code this way. Okay, so I want to implement this, and we will try to implement this. So let's keep going. Okay, So with that, let's actually jump on to my Visual Studio Code. So last session, actually, so this is a project from the last session. The recordings for this is already on our YouTube channel. So you can actually go and look at the recordings. What we were doing is we were learning how to use connected apps and JWT token flow. So with that, I had implemented a simple connection for a Node application to Salesforce. And I have hosted this app. This is already on Heroku. There's an app that's already on Heroku, and it basically connects to Salesforce using the JWT token, and then essentially it queries for the account and just shows the account. Let's see if that app is running fine. It was designed last time. I just wanted to use that to build today. So this was the app that we built, and essentially, as I said, when I try to run this application, again, Heroku on a free dyno, so it's gonna take some time for the first request to wake up. So I hope that the request actually wakes up and it's able to connect to Salesforce. So there you go. So it's actually working fine. It's able to reach into Salesforce, right? So let's enhance this app to show an use case or an example of how to implement a Composite Graph API. Okay. So the first thing I want to do is just add a JS file. So let's add a JS file and call it as composite. Let's keep it like this. Maybe call it as composite graph builder or something like this. And it'll be a JS file. And one of the things that I like about JavaScript ES6 is, it provides the class, and class makes it easier. It at least makes it easier for me, coming from an object-oriented background, to understand and write program in the way I'm used to, without having to worry about functions and chaining of the functions and stuff like that. So I can use the class. So let's use the ES6 class. So let's call the class as composite. So first, let's actually design for this one. Let's design for the composite sub request builder. So let's create a class called composite sub request builder. So we want to create a class called composite sub request builder. Classes in JavaScript are fun. So one thing you have to know is there's an explicit thing called constructor, unlike Apex, where you can just use the class name as the constructor name, and there's some little difference. Now what I want to do is I can say this dot and say composite. So I'll create an object here called composite sub request object. Okay, sub request, and this will be an object actually. So this will be an object to which we'll keep chaining stuff. So composite sub request is an object. Again, we'll keep chaining it. So now we need that first method, right? So first method is with method. So we'll create a method called with method, and the name of that method. So the name of that method. So this will pass method. And we can say this dot composite sub request dot the method that is equal to the method. And then, very important, when you're building like the Fluent interface, right, you actually return the class itself. So I can come here and say return this. This here is the class. Okay. So this is how I'm going to implement the other ones. Let's quickly do the other ones. So what else do we need? So we need the URL. I'm going to say with URL, and then it will have URL. This is a lot of typing now. So this dot composite sub request dot URL equals URL. What was the next one? With reference ID. Let's use that. With reference ID. So here in the reference ID, again, it'll be reference ID, and then say Same thing. Again, it's a lot verbose, but you will see the advantage once we sort of use it. It's pretty verbose. Your code will be verbose, but once you, and the final thing is build method. So build method actually takes nothing. It just returns the whole object actually. So I can add the methods and URL and build it. Okay. Now let's actually create another class here. Let's create another class for the graph. So I can call that as graph builder. Say graph builder. Again, the constructor is important constructor, and the constructor will be, so we need the object graph, right? So as you can see, what does this graph object look like? Where was our JSON? So if you look at our graph object, it's actually an array, okay? And it has this thing called graph ID, and then it has an array of composite request, okay? So that means we need that object called graph, okay? And then we also need this another object. So the graph will be an object, right? And it will have the composite sub request. So it will have the graph will have, what is it called? Let's look at it. So it'll have this composite request, which will be an array basically. So you say graph.composite request, and this will be an array. Okay. So it's this object, and we know this, right? And then we need the stuff. So we say with graph ID, right? And we will pass the graph ID, and say this dot graph ID equals graph ID, and then return the class itself for the chaining. So we say return this. Okay. The next thing I want to do is, okay, so if you look at the API, right, it's an array. So we want to implement something that we can keep adding to it, right? So I'm going to say add composite request, right? Or sub request composite. I think it's sub request. So we add, it's called composite request, but we are adding a sub request to it. Okay, so we go and say add dot composite request dot add, sorry, push. Okay, so push this, and then we return the whole thing for chaining. Okay, looks neat. The next thing is the final thing is build, where we just return the whole object. Return this dot what is this, graph.composite request, or the graph itself. All right, there you go. So now we've implemented both, right? So if we compare to this, we have this implementation of graph builder, right, with graph ID, and I can keep adding the composite request, and then I finally build my graph. Okay, so we have the composite request, we have the graph request. Finally, we need the composite graph builder, which essentially will be very, very similar to the one that we did, except it doesn't have the graph ID. So let's actually create one. Let's create a class. So this time we will call the class as, what should we call the class? The class name is composite graph builder. Okay, composite graph builder. One sec. Let's see. Is there any chats? Let's see if there are any chats here that require some attention. Everybody's quiet today, I guess. Yeah, not chats. Okay, no worries. Okay, so let's get back. So again, we need a constructor. Constructor. Where's the constructor? Why is it not auto suggesting the constructor to me? Oh, see, if you do a mistake here, your IDE also stops working as you expect. And then we say this dot. Okay, finally, so this will be the final one, right? So this will be the composite request. We're gonna say composite request. Be an object, and then this will also have the composite request has what we call the graphs, right? It's called graphs. Let's see what it's called graphs. Again, it will, okay, so it's called graphs. And what we need to do here is, again, so we need to build this, which is fine. Before that, we need a method called add. So just like how we have add composite sub request, right? This method will be, okay, so this method will be add graph, right? Okay, so let's say add graph. And then add graph will have a thing called graph. And then what we want to do is this guy, right? So we just copy this, or type plot graphs dot add, and we add the graph. And once we do that, we want to return the whole object for chaining. And then finally we have build, which takes nothing but return this dot. What's that? Where's that? Where's, there you go. Okay, so now let's actually save this and also format this a bit better. Format, there you go, looks better now. Okay, so we have graph builder, we have composite builder. Now this class I want to export, okay, and that is where the module, the node modules will be a huge win. So let's use the node module. So we can do this module dot exports equals, right? Now I can export all of them. So I'm going to export the graph builder. Let's export first this. It doesn't matter the order, but then the graph builder, and then finally the composite graph builder. Okay, this looks good. This looks good. I am happy with it. So okay, so this is the implementation right now. Let's test this, that this works, and then we can essentially you know incorporate this in our thing. So the way we can test this very easily is by creating one more file which I can delete later called this, and then you know I can say const request, I can say require, and say just import that composite graph builder, right? Okay, and then I start constructing those stuff. So essentially it'll be this whole thing. I wish I, okay, looks like I created this and then for some reason it's screenshot. So yeah, so essentially from this point I should be able to build this. I quickly check if I have this file in my machine. I don't want to type these, but I might end up typing. Let's see. So I have this request. I have that file. Okay, let's actually type it. It's fun to type also. Okay, so one of the things I want to show here is look at how easy it is to, so let's start with lead, right? So const lead will have the last name. That's the last name of the lead. This is not, I don't want JavaScript. Let's let it be like this. Let's just be like, so now I can easily say, okay, I want to build a composite sub request, right? So I can say this, and then the moment I put like dot, it should show me up. I guess I have to do this. Okay, I know why this is happening. It could be because it's a new request. There you go. So now you have just give me a sec, I'll be back. Just give me a sec. Can any one of you confirm that you're able to see the stream? Okay, thank you. Thanks for the confirmation. Okay, I thought, I lost the stream. Okay, thank you so much. As I said, it's storming here, so expect some delay here. I bumped my bitrate as well. Still some issues happening. Okay, I'll keep continuing if you guys can see my screen. Okay, so with body, let's say our body in this case is the lead. And then, okay. All right. With method, the method is post, right? And then with reference ID, the reference ID could be lead1. And then what else we have? Method body URL, and the URL would be something like this, right? Something like this. Okay, so this will be the lead, right? Because we are posting to the lead, right? And then finally I come and say, okay, I want to build, right? So this is how you build a composite request with the system that we have in place. So let's do another one. So we do a campaign. Again, same thing. I'm just going to use one field. Campaign has name. And we're going to say name. And then the name is campaign 1. And then, the campaign composite request. Composite. Composite request equals new request dot composite sub request builder, dot with body. So the body will be the campaign. And then with method, with method post dot with reference ID. Let's go back and say reference ID, and the reference ID will be campaign1. Okay, and with URL, boring stuff we got to do the work, and then say dot build. Okay, so here I just have to change this to campaign. Okay, so this looks good. Now let's build one for campaign members. So we are in, so this example shows how to do that for a campaign member. So campaign member, now this is where it is very, very important what you put. So campaign member is a junction object between campaign and lead, right? So we will need a lead. So let's do this. So we need a lead ID. So we say lead ID, and the lead ID will be, so watch this. This is where it is very important. So you have to put the lead, which is, so what was the reference ID? Lead one, right? So you have to say lead1.id like this. So this is very important. The next stuff is, let's see, the next stuff is, yeah, so we also need campaign ID, right? So campaign ID, again, same thing. You can use that reference ID. So you can say this. And then what is the campaign? So the campaign, we named it as campaign1. That was the reference ID, campaign1.id. That's it. So this is how you construct the references if it has the reference with using the reference ID. So now same thing, we can even just copy this actually. Copy this. Instead of saying campaign, we can say campaign member with body of campaign member. Again, it is posting the data. Reference ID could be campaign member one, and this would be campaign member. Yeah, actually I would prefer this to use capitals here. Campaign member. Okay, references IDs are fine, the data is fine. Okay, so once we do this, right, the next step is to actually build the, what's our next step? The next step is to build the graph essentially. So we say const, we can call it as graph1, right? So graph1 equals new, and then we can say, so the class name was graph builder. So we can say graph builder. Okay, so let's see, graph builder, and say dot with, okay, why is it not working? New graph, was it called, oh, okay, one thing we have to keep in mind that it has to be request dot. So request dot, okay, now it is reading. So dot with graph ID, we can put a sample graph ID called graph1. Oh, we have a emergency weather alert. Interesting. Hopefully the streams don't go off. Okay, next step is add composite requests, right? So we have to add 3 of them. So let's put 3 of them. then say dot build. I have to add. So if you hover over it, it will show that it requires a composite sub request, as you can see. So it requires one of these sub requests. So lead campaign member. Right now, the final step. So the final step is we can call it as input, graph input, or graph API input, something like this. That is equal to new request dot composite. What is the class name? Was Composite Graph Builder. Okay. Dot. So we need to provide add composite, or sorry, this is add graph. So you add the graph, and then you say dot, or we say build. Okay. So, oh, that's it. There you go. So this is the stuff, right? This is the final stuff. So now let's actually log this to see if this is all working fine before we actually implement this. So console.log graph API input. Let's see if this is, let's see if our implementation was correct. We can test this. Okay, so seems like everything is fine. We'll come to know if this is working or not. So you can, to run any node program, you just say node and then there's an error. So what is the error? Add is not a function. Of course, add is not a function. We can fix that. So old habits of Apex, right? Let's fix. There you go. Okay. So let's do this. Okay, so our graphs look really good, you know. So this is exactly what we need to send to the API. So we are able to build this with this work here. Okay, so let's actually move this whole stuff into the actual file, right? So here we were, so previously we were actually just sending a response like this. Now what I want in this one is, so let's import this at the top, and then all of this is fine. So wait, dot, there is a thing called request APIs of, let's go to the APIs of, there is something called request body. In fact, we've used this JSForce. We've used this in our e-cars actually. If you go to the JS docs, right? So let's search for that request. It's called request post, I guess. Let's see. Yeah, so this one, right? So you can say request start, so call Apex. So you can, so this is for calling Apex. Let's see here. So here, I'm pretty sure somewhere we implemented this whole thing. Let's see. So here it is, right? So we can say connection.request post, and it will have the graph API input and the graph APIs that we require. So something like this, right? So let's actually go back here and say same thing, connection dot. So this is the response, right? So await connection dot request post. So this will have the graph API input. Also, let's make sure that our versions are fine here. So what is our versions? 50. Okay, so I'm using 50. Let's change it to 51 just to be on the latest. Again, this whole thing can be simplified a bit more. But for now, I'm just gonna go with it. Okay, so here it is, right? So let's get rid of this one. So we say response, right? So this is the response, and I want to send that response basically. So we can look at the structure of the response. So yeah, so we construct the data, we use the connection.request post, and then we essentially post it, and then I'm sending the response here. Okay, I think we are good with this, and let's see actually what happens. So let's blow the screen a bit more so that you can see my terminal. Okay, so now we need that Heroku magic, right? So we say get add dot get commit implement graph API or composite graph API commit. All right, so let's now push to Heroku. So I just did a Heroku login, and then Heroku so we execute git push Heroku main, right? So now this should be building the source, and it should deploy it onto the Heroku server. There you go. So the build is successful. It's compressing. All right, seems like it's deployed. So now let's go back to the browser window and look at the Heroku or launch this application. Click on it. Then open app. Okay, so there is some sort of a parser error that's coming. So let's try again. So let's debug what's going wrong. So we can actually tail logs or view the logs here. Okay, so looks like the URL is not a valid field. So let's actually fix that. Let's come back to our code. So URL is not a valid field, is what it's saying. Okay, so let's actually go back to our builder and see if we have the right stuff here. So composite dot URL. Okay, it could be because this field might be small, and this might be a small one. So we can actually use this, but then let's keep this small because I think the JSON is pretty strict with respect to the casing. All right, so let's give a shot. So we change, I'm gonna say git add dot and git commit, fix syntax issue, and then git push Heroku main. There you go. Yeah, so the URL was not a valid field, which makes sense, and that's why it went and said it cannot parse the JSON. Okay, so it looks like our build has succeeded. Let's give one more shot. Hopefully it goes fine this time. Oh, there you go. There you go. So we see a beautiful response. Okay, so let's see. All right. Okay, so I see the response here. Now, let's actually go and see this data in Salesforce. So I'm going to log into that Salesforce environment and make sure that we have the data created via the Composite Graph API. So I'm going to say view all. Let's see campaigns. We go look at our campaign. So campaign 1, this is right. This is what I created. And also I see there's one lead, which is what I wanted. And there's one campaign member, and I can view the campaign member, which is a lead. Okay, so seems like everything is working fine as expected. All right, so let's recap a bit of what we just did. So I created a file called Composite Graph Builder, which essentially is a JavaScript class. And then I have a pattern, Fluent Interface pattern, where we return the class itself so that we can chain further methods to it. It also has a simple build method which returns the object. So I construct all of these, I export them as a module so that we can import it. And then we actually come back and import these modules. As you can see, I just imported a request module, graph request. And the next step that I do is essentially create these composite request or sub request. And then I use the graph builder and add the sub requests. And then finally, I create a graph input API input, which is the graph that I want to push. And then finally, I can push it using the connection object of JSForce. Okay, with that, I think we should wind this up and, let's wind it with last few slides here. With that, let's wind it up. You can connect with us on our website, developer.salesforce.com, and also use the Twitter handle @SalesforceDevs, and also we are social. So you can connect with us on Facebook, LinkedIn, or YouTube. Thank you so much for joining this session, and see you next time. Thank you.